Every now and then, in the pages of history, there is a person with great personal courage which emerges and who opposes the ideology of their family or community or the country. Someone who embraces a belief so different from the prevailing one that he becomes the pariah of his community. It must have been difficult for Gandhi to embark on a path of non-violent resistance when his people were being killed by the British soldiers. For Donald Woods to embrace Steve Biko's ideas of black consciousness, and to have his family become an enemy of their white community. For Nelson Mandela to hold out a hand of peace and reconciliation after so many years of being treated inhumanely. For William Wilberforce to push for the abolition of slavery in a time when the practice was universally accepted as the norm. Wilhelm Verwoerd is such a man. He was born in South Africa in 1964 and grew up during the heyday of the system of apartheid within a white Afrikaner family and with former Prime Minister Hendrik Verwoerd as grandfather. From his family estate on the hill, he could see the mountains that surrounded Stellenbosch, growing up in a place of idyllic beauty. His comfortable life was largely the product of his family identity. His grandfather, Hendrik Verwoerd, was known as the architect of apartheid for his role in formalizing South Africa's system of institutionalized racism. When Prime Minister Verwoerd was assassinated in 1966, Wilhelm was a small boy. Years later, people told him that the period when his grandfather was Prime Minister was one of the darkest times of their lives. The truth, which initially made him want to run away. Ultimately, he made a different choice. He decided to leave behind in the past what the legacy was and move forward and become involved in practical ways and use his privileges he had inherited to make a contribution to the South African society. He became a member of the African National Congress in 1992 and began to work addressing the legacy of suffering caused by apartheid. To his family and his church, however, he became an outcast. For 2 years under Nelson Mandela's government of national unity, Wilhelm served as a researcher for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, established to investigate apartheid-era human rights violations and to promote a very, very important process in South Africa, that of healing. His personal and professional journey of reconciliation continued in Ireland, where from 2002 to 2011, he worked as a coordinator of and facilitator with the Glencree survivors and former combatants program. At the end of 2012, Wilhelm moved back to South Africa to help the work of Beyond Walls, whose vision is to help people value human relationships and move from destructive to creative ways of dealing with differences. And that is actually what the South African society is still battling with. Wilhelm is the author of My Winds of Change and Looking Back, Reaching Forward, Reflections on the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In 2008, his PhD, named Equity, Mercy, Forgiveness, Interpreting Amnesty within the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, was published. He's also the author and co-author of a number of articles on politics, topics of reconciliation, forgiveness, and apology. He has a master's from Oxford University in politics, philosophy, and economics, and a PhD in applied ethics from University of Johannesburg. Clearly, he is a man of fiber and has much to offer us. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome into our presence and to deliver the John MacNaughton Address, Dr. Wilhelm Verwoerd. Thank you.
Morning, everybody. Thank you very much for that introduction. It's a bit humbling, and especially after his 2-minute speech, I feel like I'm not sure if I have much more to say. I just want to say Amen. And you know, it's quite special for me to be in a space like this. I wasn't quite expecting to see people with poppies and to have such a strong emphasis on remembrance. And part of me finds it quite difficult because I've just been working in Ireland and Northern Ireland, and many of the people I worked with came from backgrounds where they opposed the British approach to remembrance and the British remembrance of the dead. And I realized how controversial remembrance can be, how people who come from opposing sides find it difficult to come together and actually jointly remember the sacrifices and the human cost of war and conflict. And that's really what my work has been about for the last many, many years, trying to find ways where we as South Africans, but also people in places like Ireland, Northern Ireland, Israel, Palestine, so many places of deep conflict, where we can find ways to actually live together as human beings without going to war, without becoming destructive in the way we deal with difference. So I just want to offer you a few thoughts on that. I might draw on some of my professional work, but I sometimes find in spaces like this, especially with younger people who might not have the sense of history that some of the older people here might have, that it's sometimes useful just to talk a bit about personal experience, in a sense to tell a story of change and transformation, as one of our speakers also said. So I'm not going to be too academic and too philosophical about it. I want it to be rooted in a real human life journey. And hopefully, through that, you might be able to relate to it just as ordinary human beings, struggling also in South Africa today to deal with issues of division and difference, and finding a way to adhere to the vision of the school, to have a space where we can be without prejudice towards people, irrespective of their creed, or their color, or their culture, or their commitments. So, where shall I start? I think I'll start with an image that I think you might be able to relate to in terms of your own lives as well. And it's an image that was given to me by Archbishop Odama, not Obama, Odama, from northern Uganda. And I was privileged to meet him a few years ago, just as I came to the end of my time in Northern Ireland, and we were in Belfast. And he came on a visit, and he was telling people about what was going on in northern Uganda. I don't know how much of you have followed, just over the years, the horrible, horrible wars that took place with the Lord's Resistance Army and with Coney. I think there was a while where that was a very prominent internet campaign as well, to expose the brutality of that war that took place in that part of Africa. And he, as a church leader, was willing to go into those places, to literally go and meet with Coney, to go into the bushes, to try and find ways to bring people out of that violent conflict to a point where we can actually negotiate and live together in Uganda at the time. And he lost his own wife. I think she was killed by the LRA. So he came with a deep personal price as well. And he was just talking about his commitment not to allow that pain and that bitterness to imprison him, but to find ways to translate it into peace. And he said how on a weekly basis he would spend some time, he would take a day off or half a day and just pray for the rest of the world, for places where there's conflict. And he used an image of his two hands. Now we're all familiar with this as a prayer gesture. But he was sitting there, and we were just sitting around a table, a few of us, and he held his hands like that. And he said, when I'm praying, when I'm going into the space of thinking of all these places of conflict, and I look at my two hands, what these hands represent for me would be, in the first place, if I look at my 5 fingers, they represent the 5 continents of the world. We can debate whether there's 5 or 6 or 7, but if you think of it as, Eurasia and America and Africa and Australia and Antarctica, as sort of the 5 big, continental masses. And he was saying these 5 fingers for him represent, as it were, the world. And then he went on and he said, when I look at my left hand, it represents all the men in the world. When I look at my right hand, it represents all the women in the world. And he had, quite a dark brown skin, but on the inside a bit lighter skin. And he was saying, when I look on the inside of my hands, I think of all the people with lighter skins. And when I look at the outside of my hands, I think of all the people with darker skins. And when I bring these two hands together, that's the vision that I take with me into not only my prayers, but into my life. And I was just really moved by somebody with that vision. And he reminded me of Archbishop Tutu, who I was privileged to get to know during the TRC and after that. And he had that same kind of generosity of vision and spirit. I said to him, I'm so grateful for what you share with us, Archbishop Odama. But I also find myself, as I was speaking to him, saying, I feel very sad when I listen to your vision. Because when I think of my own community, and I think of the way that I grew up in South Africa, and I found myself, without thinking about it, I found myself forming a fist in my hand. And I said, when I think of my background and I think of my community, instead of having two hands like this, instead of an open-ended vision of inclusivity, I grew up with a closed fist. That was the way I would represent, as it were, the way I grew up. And I said to him, it's so sad to me that we find it so difficult to move from this space, or possibly this space, when you think of people in conflict, to move from this to this. And I thought, in a nutshell, in an image, that's really what the journey has been for me. That's what my professional work has been about. Trying to find creative ways for us not to do the instinctive thing when we're afraid, when we're angry. You can feel it in your stomach, like the sense of things becoming cramped and being closed, and how we tend to do that when we go into conflict and when we have difficult differences. How do we find ways to move from that to this, to open our hands and actually be willing to take the risk to be vulnerable, to be honest, to be real with each other, so that we can actually shake hands and move into the future together. So let me just say something about why that journey has been so difficult for me. And there were some references to it in the introduction. But I must just try and give you a bit of a sense. Those of you who are younger, I don't know whether you've been to Stellenbosch recently. I was tempted to start my introductions by saying something about Paul Roos. I thought, no, let me be sensitive to Wynberg and your history and not complicate it with my old school's history. But I very much grew up in Stellenbosch. And Stellenbosch during the 70s, 60s, 70s was a very different place to the South Africa we have today, and a very different place to the South Africa that most of you probably have experienced so far. Exclusively white Afrikaans speaking. The school, the community, the neighborhood that I grew up in, exclusively white Afrikaans speaking. The church that I went to was exclusively white Afrikaans speaking. And of course, during that time, I wasn't only part of the community, I wasn't only part of the school, I also was part of a family. And you've seen a reference to, and you've heard a reference to my grandfather, H.F. Verwoed. And many of you, especially the older people here, would probably not have very positive memories and connotations attached with that person. But when I was a young person, and this might be difficult for you to hear, especially for the black South Africans here, he was somebody who was seen within my own community and within my own family as a hero. And I was told by my teachers at school, by the ministers in church, by the people in our community, to be proud of this great leader within our own community. And why was he a great leader? Because he brought us as in the Afrikaner community, the white Afrikaner community, he brought us our freedom from English domination in South Africa. And that, ironically, was the conflict that I grew up with also. Not just fear of the majority of black South Africans, but animosity towards English-speaking white South Africans. Because in our history and in our school and the way we operated, we remembered history. And we didn't remember the First World War, we remembered the Anglo-Boer War, as it was called at the time. And so even 60 years later, as a young person, I was still growing up with that animosity. And that's why my grandfather was seen as a hero within the Afrikaner community. And I can remember the detail, how people would come to me and talk about the day that he was assassinated in Parliament. It was a very dramatic sort of political assassination. And hundreds and thousands of people lined the streets of Pretoria for the state funeral. And people were crying, and people would come to me as a young person and talk about the day that he was assassinated within the Afrikaner community, and how sad they were for the loss of this great leader. His name was all over the place. Even today, if you were to visit my parents, as you walk through the front door, there's a huge painting of him. So that was really where I came from. Now, if you think, how do you get to the point where you actually begin to hear the experience of the wider South Africa and start to hear what the name Verwoed represented and still represents for the majority of people in this country? In my case, I was lucky to get a scholarship from Rhodes, using English imperialist money to go to Rhodes, to go to Oxford. And my father wasn't happy because he was worried that I would be influenced by all these liberals who would corrupt me. And that's what happened. I got a chance to study in Holland first, and actually during that time, and I can remember arriving in Holland in 1986 with 2 huge suitcases, because that was my first time to go overseas. Not only 2 big suitcases, a big backpack. And in this backpack, I not only had clothes, I had books, Afrikaans books, because I had to prepare myself against these English liberals. And I had food, I had biscuit and biltong, and things that I sort of could use to sort of survive as a little Afrikaner, a nationalist, white South African in this, foreign world. And I arrived with all this baggage. And when I look back, that to me was very symbolic, because what had to happen during the next couple of years when I was studying in Holland and in England was that I had to start to get rid of that baggage. Because I arrived with all these ways of thinking and believing and feeling and conditioning and looking at South African history from the point of view of the Afrikaner community and from the point of view of the Verwoerd family. And I was fortunate during that time to meet South Africans with different convictions, especially black South Africans, who were able to give me a sense of what really was going on in South Africa. At that time, my brothers were fighting on the border. My one brother was at Parabat, deeply involved in Angola. Here I was meeting people who were members of the ANC, and a part of me felt like I was betraying my own brother. I was betraying my own church and my own family. But at the same time, I was hearing stories of what really was going on in South Africa and what it meant to be a black South African, a person of color, under the apartheid system. And people were not arguing with me politically, they were telling me stories. They were telling me just their life journeys. And I couldn't walk away from that. It was the kind of truth that once you hear it, it goes from your head and it touches you in your heart, in your guts, in a way that you cannot walk away from it and still look yourself in the mirror. So I had to go on a journey of beginning to question, to investigate what is really the truth. And I can remember one of the guys, I think it was Tsepiso Mashinini, who was a brother of one of the leaders of the 76 uprising in Soweto, saying to me what they did on the day that my grandfather was assassinated. And he said they walked into the streets, they ran into the streets, and they took off their shirts and they started dancing, because for them it was a day of liberation. So those stories started to creep through, to break through the fences that I built up around myself. And I had to find a way to come to terms with what the real truth was. And there was a time when it was tempting to say, I don't know what it means to be a white Afrikaner from South Africa. I wanted to run away from my own background. And again, it was black South Africans who helped me to say, in our culture, we respect our ancestors. We're not asking you to reject your own grandfather. What we're asking is, what can we do together to make a difference? And I came to a point where I realized you cannot run away from the color of your skin. You cannot run away from your background, middle class, whatever that might be. You cannot run away from your culture. You cannot run away from your religious background. And you cannot run away from your own family. The question is, what do you do with those sources of your own identity? How do I find a way to do something constructively with my life? And again, I had many people who helped me along that journey. And it's actually sometimes a source of shame for me that it took so long to get to the point of actual political involvement. But I'll just mention one more story, because obviously time is limited and you've been listening to many things. But there was a moment, and many of us have Madiba moments, but I'll just share with you the moment that actually was the straw that broke the camel's back of my fear of actually becoming involved politically. A few of us in Stellenbosch early 90s, were thinking about joining the ANC. Madiba has just been released. He came to visit us in a home setting. And I was very keen to meet him because while I was a student in Oxford, I already started to change my political views. And I wrote a letter to him to try and express to him my sense of sorrow for what my community and my family did to him. This basically was my grandfather who put him in prison for 27 years. I sent the letter, but I never got a reply. So this was going to be my opportunity to share this letter with him. Got to the point where just a few of us were standing, he came in and we greeted each other, and I just wanted to jump straight in and started to tell him what I really felt was heavy on my heart. And as I started to speak, he said basically, just wait a minute, can I ask you something first? And I said, of course. And he said, how is your grandmother? Now my grandmother was still alive at the time, living in Orania, middle of nowhere, 95, 96. This is the wife of the person who basically put him in prison for 27 years. That was his question. And then he went on and said, if she wouldn't mind, would you please convey my greetings to her? And for me, that was just one of those moments, you know, of real humanity that just, I couldn't resist. And then I got an opportunity to speak to him a little bit about the history and my grandfather and my own responsibility and my commitment to reconciliation. And again, he didn't want to speak much about the past. He said, yes, we need to deal with it, but let's find ways to work together. And that was the final invitation that brought me to a space of saying, I'm tired of being afraid. I'm tired of living in this small, little, white Afrikaner, middle-class Stellenbosch cocoon. I want to be part of this bigger South Africa, where everybody, irrespective of color and creed and culture, can be at home. And then I became part of that movement. And I can tell you many stories about that, but I don't want to go too much into detail because that's really not the point. The point that I want to get back to is that through that journey of being willing to be honest, to hear the truths from different perspectives, to meet people at the very human level and not get too stuck in my head, to become vulnerable and be honest also with myself, to go on that kind of journey, I think was the key to get to the point where this fist that I still had within me, and sometimes it comes back, it still comes back, it doesn't disappear overnight when I'm in a difficult situation. But that kind of journey of committing to be real to myself and to be real to my fellow South Africans, to be human in the first place, that kind of journey, often involving dialogue, storytelling, you know, spending time with people that you might find difficult to spend time with. Going through that kind of process has helped me to gradually start to open that fist. And because of the help from other people, including people like Madiba, I was able to get to the point where these hands could actually gradually come together. And the bottom line is, yes, it was difficult. There were times where I was not proud anymore. There was times when I had to deal with difficult emotions, like shame, guilt, and those things. But the bottom line really for me has been that by doing that, I became more alive as a human being. And that's the exciting challenge that I think we all face here in South Africa. We've got huge problems. Many things have been referred to, especially in the last speaker's points, about how much more we still have to do. But the vision that I hope that you can also share, and that I've always tried to share with my own children, is that in South Africa we have an opportunity to really do something meaningful with our lives that is not only going to be significant for South Africa, it is significant for the rest of the world. The many years I've spent overseas, in places like Ireland, Northern Ireland, Israel, Palestine, Rwanda, many other places, people look at South Africa as a source of hope. And it is my generation, but it's also your generation that I think has this huge opportunity and responsibility to really show people in the rest of the world that we can live together, even though we are very different in many ways. That we can have a humane society of respect for each other, where we can deal with the poverty that is continuing to dehumanize so many of our fellow South Africans. And we can do it not only for our own sakes, but for the sake of the rest of the world. And I just want to leave you with that vision, that we can come back to those hands of Archbishop Odama. And the reason why we do what we do with our own lives is to contribute to that vision of all the continents, all the genders, all the races, all the cultures. And that's what we really are part of with our own lives. So thank you for this opportunity, and I wish you all the best for the way you're going to engage with this journey. Thank you.
You really weren't kidding, you did actually have a lot to say. But all of it was incredibly insightful, incredibly meaningful. So on behalf of all of us here, I would just like to thank Dr. Verwoed for taking time out of his schedule to come speak to us. It's not every year that we are so fortunate and so privileged enough to get such a very insightful and awe-inspiring speaker to come speak to us. I must say, those hands, we can apply that to our own lives, especially as boys in Wynberg Boys High School, how we can integrate our own school, as in move away from a hierarchy system of matrics being the ultimate grade. And I think we do that already with tutor groups and with buddies, with grade 8 buddies, and how we can bring our all grades together and all our houses together. And ultimately it will strengthen the school, as we've seen with South Africa, where we've become a better and a stronger South Africa by coming together. While you mentioned that your grandfather was a hero, you yourself are a hero for having the courage and for taking that initiative into changing South Africa. You went against your family, against the beliefs and values of your community for what you believed in, and that's something I think we can all really be inspired by, to do what we believe is right. So please accept this gift on behalf of all of us here, and thank you again.